Good evening and welcome. I'm Ann Walters Robertson, Dean of the Division of the Humanities at the University of Chicago, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Winter Dean Salon. Our Dean Salon series highlights the pioneering research and pivotal breakthroughs of our distinguished faculty. The series explores how the humanities deepens our understanding of the ideas and social forms that shape our lives. Our speakers this evening are Tyler Williams and Ada Palmer, and they will discuss an extremely fundamental topic, the impact of books and published texts had on societies during the period of early modernity, from about 1400 to 1800. They will compare examples from the Indian subcontinent and from Europe, and they will explore the intellectual and religious changes that new types of material texts and their associated textual practices made possible. Their discussion will be followed by a Q&A session, and once again, I invite you to type your questions in the Q&A box throughout Tyler's and Ada's conversation. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can at the end. And now I'm pleased to introduce you to this evening's speakers. Tyler Williams is an associate professor in the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations. He teaches courses on the Hindi language, South Asian literature, aesthetic thought, and book history. His research focuses on the relationships between material forms of writing, performance practices, and intellectual history. His forthcoming first book, If All the World Were Paper, A History of Writing in Hindi, traces the development of the Hindi language from an oral medium used for song into a written literary medium that in turn generated a variety of new book forms across northern India. And Ada Palmer is Associate Professor of History. She is a cultural and intellectual historian who focuses on radical thought and the recovery of the classics in the Italian Renaissance. She works on the history of science, religion, heresy, free thought, atheism, censorship, books, printing, and patronage, and the networks of power and money that enabled cultural creation in early modern Europe. Her first book, Reading Lucretius in the Renaissance, focuses on the challenges that Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, posed to Christian thought in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. And now I'm so excited to turn the virtual podium over to Tyler and to Ada.
Thank you, Dean Robertson. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the audience for giving me a chance to share this. I'll just jump right into it. I'm going to be talking about early modern South Asia. And when we say early modern in the context of South Asia, we mean generally about 1200 of the Common Era to about 1700 or 1750 of the Common Era. 1200 being when Sultanate rule was established in the northern part of the subcontinent, and the middle of the 18th century when European colonialism was consolidated in the subcontinent. May we go to the next slide, please? So prior to 1200, prior to the dawn of the early modern period in South Asia, the majority of written communication, literary and scientific, was conducted on palm leaf and on birch bark in South Asia. Now, a huge part of South Asian literary and intellectual culture from the ancient period through the medieval period was the oral memorization of texts. And when I say texts, I mean texts that would be as long as novels, as long as the Odyssey or the Iliad. Memorizing texts like that was part of one's basic education. And this was conducted in Sanskrit, Prakrit, Upper Brahmsha, Tamil, and other languages. Now, written texts also circulated on palm leaf manuscripts, and what you have here is an example of that. Palm leaf manuscript was made of palm leaves, which were cut, which were dried, and which were written upon with ink, and sometimes illustrated, as you see in the example here. They were never bound. The sheets of a palm leaf manuscript always remained separate, except when they weren't in use, when they'd be bound with a string that would be passed through a hole either in the middle of the sheets or around the entire block. And as you can see here by the date of this manuscript, palm leaves continued to be used into the early modern period, and in fact into the 20th century. Next slide, please. Now, in 1200 or around there, when Sultanate rule was established in North India by Persianized Turks from Central Asia, they brought with them not only Islamic culture, including Persian and Arabic, but they also brought the codex book, the idea of a bound book. And along with it, they brought paper, and this being cloth paper, paper made from cotton cloth rags. And this is the beginning of when we see these kind of illustrated codex books like the one you see here. This is a classic example from the late Sultanate period of a codex book, a codex copy of a book by a classic author of the Sultanate period, Amir Khusro. This is the Khamsa. It's a quintet of Persian stories. And as you can see, this one is illustrated, although the scribes and the paper makers who were responsible for this book would have come from Central Asia or would have been the descendants of Central Asian immigrants to the area, the illustrators of this manuscript, and many like it, were actually Hindus and Jains. So the products of the book culture there are composite objects which were produced by members of multiple religious cultural communities. Next slide, please. Now, even though after 1200, cloth paper began to be imported, and maybe 100 years after that produced in South Asia, it took at least 200 years for the use of paper to catch on there. And in fact, when in the south, in the southern part of the subcontinent, communities continued to use palm leaf much in excess of paper. Paper never really caught on. And even in the northern part of the subcontinent, when the use of paper did catch on, lots of communities continued to create books in much the same way as they had when they had used palm leaf. What you have in front of you right now is a 16th century example of a paper pustak or poti. Pustak or poti are what the palm leaf manuscripts were called. And as you can see here, this paper manuscript looks a lot like the palm leaf archetype. It even has a little hole in the middle of it where the vestigial string would have passed through. Next slide, please. Now, around the turn of the 17th century begins a kind of high point in the intellectual and the book culture of the subcontinent. This is the time when the Mughals, being also known as the Mongols, come down from Central Asia, establish the Mughal Empire. And this is kind of, again, a high watermark for intellectual and literary culture. Authors and scholars are writing in Sanskrit, Prakrit, Upper Brahmsha, Tamil. They're writing in vernacular languages like Rajasthani, Gujarati, Bengali, Hindi. They're writing in Persian, and they're writing in Arabic. And they are debating philosophical, scholastic, literary ideas taken from the Arabic tradition, the Persian tradition, incidentally, the Greek traditions, Unani medicine, and Greek Neoplatonic philosophy, which had come through the Arabic tradition. And of course, all of the Indic sciences, which had come through the Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Pali traditions. I'll wrap up by actually just drawing your attention to two examples. One is the paper manuscript you see here. By this point, by about the middle of the 1600s, scholars and authors had started to exploit paper, the possibilities of paper, to do all sorts of things. Like this book, for example, involves a root text on philosophy, on the 9 elements or 9 truths, which is written in the language of Prakrit. That's the big type, along with a commentary in the vernacular language of Old Rajasthani or Old Gujarati, which is the small type. Can I show just one more slide, please? The next. And finally, this is a page from a codex book. And books in South Asia like this one might have been, copied by an owner for themselves, by someone for someone else's individual use, for circulation, or for public performance. But all books in this period are really, they're either palimpsests or it contain many layers of notes by the people who use them over time. And if you squint really hard at this image, you can see the text that's written on there in this book. It's the Padmavat. It's a vernacular romance, Islamic Sufi mystical allegorical romance. But what you see all of that around it are the notes of a couple of readers, mostly of the first person who owned the book, who, as he read, noted every kind of association and quote that came to his mind from Persian epics, vernacular songs, and as well as glosses of the words that he saw there. So every book from this period contains really traces of a multilingual culture, since most authors, most scholars and intellectuals of the period were, to some extent or another, multilingual, working in a classical language and a vernacular language at the same time, and carrying on these exchanges between Hindu, Jain, Muslim, and Sikh traditions. And with that, I'd actually like to stop my my introductory comments here and hand it over to my colleague, Ada Palmer.
Great. Continuing from that, if I can plunge into my images as we jump over to the European and, importantly, Mediterranean worlds, centering not on the colorful bit that is Europe, but on the Mediterranean segment, including North Africa and the East, which are always core to the book production world of Europe. One of the things we see in both of these is that innovations in how books are made and put together and what is in a book and the format of a book had a huge effect on how books could be used and who could have access to books. Next slide, please. We tend to think of the Gutenberg printing press revolution in 1450 with the development of movable type as the most important change. And it is an important change because it means that the labor that went into producing one book could now produce 300 books, and the cost that went into producing one book can now produce 300 copies of that book, which meant that you could disseminate things very rapidly. But please jump to the next slide if you would. In a lot of ways, the difference between a printed book and a manuscript book can be very negligible. And here you're looking at a printed book and a manuscript book. And unless you're an expert and zoom way in, it's actually very difficult to tell which one is which, because at the beginning of the print period, people were just trying to print things to be as similar as possible to manuscripts. There's a separate revolution when you realize, wait a minute, we can start making books in wildly different formats and invent new ways to do it. So if you think about the difference between these two books, next slide, please. I think the next one will zoom in even further on, there is a manuscript book above and a printed book below where the typeface is attempting to imitate the handwriting. But if you think about the difference between these two texts, which is the same text with the same decorating style in the same font, and then jump to the next slide, the difference between a book like this, which is a just before movable print is developed book, it's a codex, so a bound book with a spine and pages. It has the handwritten text on the right, some decoration. You can see that just like in the Indian subcontinent, the owner has been making notes in the margins. But if you jump from that then to the next slide, you'll see differences in the content of a page or differences in the scale of a book. And you can see all three of the books in front of you right now are the same text. These are 3 copies of Lucretius's epic poem about atomist physics. But the giant one is the main text in big font and then elaborate analysis of it in the margins in a smaller font and printed notes about those analysis in the margins even further. And then down below it, I'm holding a tiny, tiny pocket copy. Or actually, that one is designed for a gentleman to be able to slide it up his sleeve so that he can edify himself with elegant Latin poetry while he's waiting to see the Duke or whatever. This is a sleeve book. which rapidly and vastly multiplies the uses a text can be put to. It can be for personal reading, for personal note taking, for deep scholarly analysis, or for, quick popping it out in a moment. And the book on the left, the manuscript, that circa 1300 or 1400 costs as much as a house. And an inexpensive, undecorated manuscript is going to cost you what it would cost to build a, apartment or own an apartment in a city. And a big, fancy, illuminated Bible is going to cost you what it costs to build a mansion. A book is a huge, expensive thing. Print rapidly reduces that. And between 1450 and 1500, the cost of a book costs from being as much as a house to being as much as a school teacher's salary for 1 month, which is still a lot, but enormously less than a house. And that change means that the kind of person who can own a book expands. Now Michelangelo can own 6 books, for example, when he's in the 1520s. Whereas, earlier than that, to even own any books, you had to be super rich. And more significantly, a mid-sized town by 1550 can have a library. Whereas in the manuscript period, only giant capitals can have a library. Paris and the great library of the University of Paris, which was the greatest library in the medieval world in Europe, had 300 books. Not very many books. Your house probably has more than 300 books in it. Certainly every kiosk that sells books in an airport does. And part of that is print, but only a small part of that is print, which from the fact that at the same time in the Middle East, the sultans had manuscript collections of 7,000 to 10,000 books. And the same was true in Central Asia, where you had huge collections of thousands of books while Europe had only hundreds. Why? Next slide, please. One of the reasons is just the format and the materials. So here is a music book, an antiphony, a very typical kind of book in the Middle Ages. The next slide will show how it's used. It's a very physically large book so that it can be up on a stand and the whole choir or the whole gathering of nuns can all read it from a distance. And that means the pages are very large. The pages are, 2 feet high. And next slide, the core problem with this is that the pages are made out of a dead sheep, and a dead sheep is expensive. Palm leaf is cheap. Papyrus, which was the written surface of the ancient world up through the Roman world, was cheap. Plant-sourced ways of writing are cheap, but a dead sheep is very expensive. That is what medieval Europe has. Ancient Europe used papyrus and exported it from where it grew in the southern Mediterranean and in Egypt. But when the empire falls, next slide, papyrus production gets cut off because there are pirates in the Mediterranean and you can't get papyrus anymore. The large-scale, efficient bureaucracies that were possible to make the ancient world run become impossible when every single page is the cost of a leather jacket to make a large book. Next slide, please. So in many ways, one of the things that makes later book culture being able to prosper, which is the same thing that makes book culture be able to prosper in the Indian subcontinent more than it did in medieval Europe, is having affordable surfaces. Rag paper, which is literally made out of taking rags, putting them in water and beating them up until they fall apart into fibers, and you make that into a page. Rags are a lot cheaper than a sheep. And if you show the next slide, the transition from leather pages to paper pages, or in this case, a leather binding on the right to a paper binding on the left, reduced the cost of manuscripts enormously in parallel to Gutenberg's revolution. Because making rag paper is using one of the cheapest materials in the world. Next slide, this is a pile of rags and the other is sheep. But the pile of rags, that color. You see the color of that pile of rag book that's a sort of grayish blue? Next slide. Rag paper is literally laundry lint. It's what happens when you put rags in water and then you beat them with a machine. It is a very affordable material. And while it takes time for it to replace the earlier method, it is just as important as print in transforming how affordable a book is, how much of an environmental and labor load a book has, and thus creating the enabler of modern society, which is widespread availability of education. You know, a library in every town, universities being able to own books, students being able to own books. Those are the good sides of affordable books. Next slide will show you one of the bad sides of affordable books, which is once you have affordable books, you can also burn them and destroy them. And even things like the Inquisition's mass destruction of books doesn't begin when a book costs as much as a house. The Inquisition isn't going to destroy that, they're going to keep it. Book burning is actually very rare until books get cheap. And it's when books are cheap that the destruction of literature even makes sense. With other things, you at least scrape the text off and reuse it. So I will flip to my final slide. Engagement with these books transforms as the books transform. And, you know, the fact that you can engage with a paper book personally, lightly, even whimsically, is a neat one. So this is one of the treasures of UChicago's library. It is a 1480s grammar textbook that teaches you correct grammar, in which the student has drawn pornographic doodles. And then a later owner of the book has attempted to ink out the pornographic doodles, but you can still mostly tell what they were despite. And it's just so amazing seeing this and thinking about the transformation. This is still a manuscript, but it's a manuscript that people are willing to be a lot more fun and whimsical with because of the transition from leather to paper, as well as the advent of print. All right, that ends my talk, and now we will have our dialogue back and forth. Riffing off of each other and these fun parallel themes. And I think we don't need the PowerPoint at this point. Tyler, do you have thoughts on, I mean, you talked about the fascinating continuance of using palm leaf for a very long time, but it makes sense. It's a simple, low manual labor, affordable surface. And Europe would have been using papyrus if it could.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, it's pretty the natural history aspect of it, of the media ecology, if you will, of South Asia is actually pretty straightforward in some ways. The Palmyra palm, the Talipot palm, the Sanchi palm, the different types of palm trees from which palm leaf manuscripts were made are much more common in the southern part, what we call peninsular India, than they were in northern India. And so it just remained much cheaper and much more efficient to create and use palm leaf manuscripts. Where in the north, there are fewer palms. Also, the conditions there, particularly in the states of Rajasthan and Gujarat, which are in the northwest, are particularly good for the production of cloth paper. And so cloth paper ended up being the cheaper, more efficient alternative in the north, palm leaf in the south. And what you actually see is when scholars from the north send books south, they send them on paper, and letters in response or books sent back in response are sent on palm leaf. And this is the way that those materials move around the subcontinent.
Right.
Yeah. In the case of Europe, I'm curious about to hear more about the parchment, excuse me, not the parchment, the papyrus crisis, how this was precipitated and how quickly was their response to it.
So the papyrus crisis is actually one that they were prepared for because it was an old tactic of Egypt to blockade papyrus exports whenever Egypt was at war with Rome. And Egypt knew that it could shut down Rome's infrastructure and bureaucracy if it blockaded papyrus export. So Europe had long known this is something that is going to periodically happen. And we're going to have periodic spikes in the need for either leather or the short-term writing surface of the ancient world, which is used throughout the Middle Ages as well, which is a wax tablet, where you scrape text into the surface of wax on a piece of wood and then melt it and reuse it when you don't need it anymore. So Europe was prepared for that, but being prepared for a short-term papyrus blockade is very different from being prepared for, we're just not going to be able to get papyrus at all. And the number of human beings necessary for the mass husbandry of sheep and the tanning of leather, which was a very labor-intensive and unpleasant process involving urine as one of the major chemical transformers in order to stretch and bleach the hide, meant that there was a huge crunch in the availability of written surface. Fascinatingly, most people imagine that the books from antiquity that were lost and didn't make it to the present were mostly lost either in the burning of the Library of Alexandria or in sort of deliberate destruction. But the vast majority of what we lost from Greek and Roman antiquity was lost between the 4th and 6th centuries AD, which is when the last of the papyri were falling apart. Because papyrus only lasts a few centuries before it crumbles. It doesn't have a long last. And it is one of our shortest duration written surfaces. If it's inside a mummy or in other, implausibly perfect preservation circumstances, it'll last longer. But a papyrus book will fall apart after 400 years maximum, which meant 400 to 600 AD was when the last books on papyrus that had been kept and reused and reread were falling apart, and they had to rapidly transcribe them onto leather, and there wasn't enough leather. There just actually wasn't enough leather in the world to save these books. And we have this fascinating moment of unintended censorship, because people said, okay, we can't copy all the books. We have to prioritize. What do we prioritize? Well, we're monks. We prioritize things monks want, which is why we have more surviving books by St. Augustine than the entire classical Latin corpus. Because when there was a shortage of leather, you copied the things that were most important to you personally. And it was mostly monks who were running the scriptoria. So we had a curation down of a much vaster corpus, because they just actually couldn't produce leather fast enough to transcribe the number of books that there were.
Yeah, in our business, we always have to be aware of this, right? Survival bias. It's something that can actually skew the conclusions we might draw from the written archive. I'm curious to hear more about Europe and as a researcher, how you kind of keep that in mind. For South Asia, the big, the crumbly substance is birch bark. Birch bark just does not last. And in fact, we have much older palm leaf manuscripts than we would do a lot of paper manuscripts, because the paper manuscripts might actually fall apart much more quickly. The
Right.
other kind of, that's one of the kind of troubles or things we have to, adjust for as we're looking at the written archive. The other thing, and I got this out of listening to your opening comments, Ada, is that one has to avoid falling into a kind of technological determinism, right? Where it's like, oh, Gutenberg's press comes, and then suddenly all of the kind of social and intellectual changes just follow from that. I mean, in South Asia, people assume that, yes, printing just immediately revolutionized everything. They actually assume the same thing about paper. And in fact, I mentioned 1200 is kind of the beginning time for the use of paper. Paper had been introduced to the peoples of South Asia several times before that. People knew about paper. It's just that it didn't have any immediate benefits over other writing surfaces. And also just the practices didn't change. Like you saw with the book formats, people didn't suddenly start exploiting the visual, the format, the page layout possibilities of paper. It took actually at least a few centuries before they started making those changes. And I gathered from your comments that in Europe, it's the same thing. It's not just that a technological change happens.
Yeah, there has to be a change in demand at what people are using books for. People have to change and have a new desire. And in fact, paper making, rag paper making, hits Europe in 800 AD. But our oldest sort of serious documents on paper produced in Europe aren't until 1200. That it's actually 400 years between when they have paper and when they decide to use paper to make anything but, the scrap on which artists draw the sketch before they do the serious thing. that there is a wariness about paper because parchment lasts. Parchment is strong. Parchment, you can pull it and it doesn't rip. Parchment is really hardy, right? We don't know how long parchment lasts. It's longer than when humanity invented parchment to the present. Parchment lasts minimum 4,000 years. We haven't hit the life expectancy end of parchment. And, the British Parliament only actually switched over from keeping its official records on parchment to paper about 3 years ago. Because that was when there were finally chemists who were confident that they had developed paper that would last 4,000 years. And you want your records to last. So you want to use a medium that is tried and true. You use a dead sheet. And there was a lot of uncertainty in a world that was used to what is a book? It's a big, serious tome. It's a giant investment like a house. We're going to use it for generations. We want to make sure it's made out of really solid stuff. So the first things that they use paper for are sort of semi-disposable things. If you go to Venice and go to the Secret Archive, which wasn't very secret, it was in a huge building that said Secret Archive on the outside, but the secret is supposed to intimidate you. And in the Secret Archive, they keep things like the tenure documents for faculty at the university. So if you go there and pull up Galileo's tenure file, which is a very popular book to pull up in the Secret Archive in Venice, the final formal draft, just with the comments of the tenure committee, his mathematical work seems very important, so we should tenure him on that, even though the telescope is super sketchy, which is what it actually says. That is on leather. That is on parchment and in a nice, beautiful bound copy with a lovely lion on the cover. And the rough draft is on paper in the, people who are taking notes at the meeting with actually Galileo's, his own articulation of why the telescope mattered and what his math stuff was and why they should give him tenure. That is in the paper copy, but not in the formal copy. And it isn't until people start thinking, no, we want to have libraries everywhere. We want even small towns to have libraries. We want even artists to own books, that then they start using paper. Even Gutenberg inventing the press doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from demand for books went up. Demand for books went up, and therefore a technology to meet that demand was developed because people were using books in new ways. And I'm sure you see the same. It's the people that drive the need for and use of the new media or technologies, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in fact, the way, even when technology drives some kinds of change, it's not in the intentionality of it per se. Several years ago, they asked, how does Apple develop products and apps for the iPhone, and they said, well, we don't actually think that we don't plan for people to use our products, our devices, and our apps in a particular way. Instead, we create something, we give it to users, and we suddenly see what they're doing with it. A rough, and I admit this is a very rough analog, is that in the subcontinent, again, when Mughals established their control over the northern part of the subcontinent around the 1590s, 1600, they are a paper state. They're one of the famous gunpowder empires, along with the Safavids, the Ottomans, but they're also a paper state. They want to know about everything that's going on in the empire, and they want to document it, and they want to be able to tax and, keep records on absolutely every single thing that's going on. One unpredictable outcome of this is that because they needed paper, they set up paper making centers in a bunch of different cities. They subsidized the production of paper, and they started creating these huge archives. But the effect it had on literary and religious culture could not have been predicted, because what the Mughals and the Rajput, the Hindu Rajput nobles, who were also part of the Mughal elite, began doing is they started producing these very roughly made, very cheap and easy to make bound notebooks to keep records, financial records, court records, and so on and so forth. Not long after that, though, we see in the archive all of these individuals' personal notebooks showing up, where they're not only keeping records of their financial transactions, but they're writing down the hymns that they're hearing when they go to religious gatherings. They're writing down the songs and the poems that are being produced in the vernacular language that they're using in the everyday. And this is actually the earliest kind of stratum, the earliest layer of the vernacular literature archive in North India, is actually these everyday folks who just, oh yeah, I'm keeping track of my accounts, but I've also, I also like this poetry. And so it's actually kind of the bureaucratic and the financial accounting paper trails that then lead to a new kind of literary book.
Yeah, well, and exactly that happens in the Renaissance, specifically in Florence. We think of Renaissance Florence as a major flourishing and center of thought and literary output, which it is. But a big part of that is that the literacy rate was ridiculously high. It was in 1500, the literacy rate in Renaissance Florence was 90% among men. Which is high even for the modern world. And the reason for that was its really weird currency system, where it didn't have small coins. It only had like gold coins that were worth about $2,000. So you couldn't walk into a restaurant and buy dinner and pay for it with coins unless you happened to have some Roman pennies and they were willing to take them. And I mean ancient Roman pennies. What you had to do was have a tab, and you would go to the restaurant and eat, and they'd put it on the tab, and you would eat at the restaurant until you build up $2,000 worth of tab at the restaurant and then pay for it with a coin. And you would do this not only at the restaurant, but also at the bakery, and also at the takeout noodle place, and also at the place where you would buy meat to take home and roast over the fire, and also at the candle wax place. And you might run up $500 worth of tab at one of them and then bring them the $2,000 coin and say, okay, and then I want you to take the extra $1,500 and pay off my tab at these 3 other businesses. And the other 3 businesses will have to keep track of this. So everybody has to be literate, because you have to keep track of where your $2,000 coin is going. And now you have a country which has a literacy rate of 90% among men and something close to 70% among women. And then you have a literary explosion, not because of anything other than bureaucratic details of daily life facilitating this and making it easy. So a very parallel circumstance. We very often see that the adoption of a new technology will begin with sort of one niche application and then spread from that to everything else. So paper, inexpensive paper for keeping track of personal notes, account books and so on, disseminating literacy. But it's very parallel to the e-reader, for example, which when ebooks were first developed, there wasn't really an ebook economy until romance readers started buying things on ebook. It was actually romance novels that made the ebook be a thing. Because romance novels, A, read huge numbers of books once and don't want them piling up in their house. B, read books where when colleagues or coworkers or random people on the train see you reading a book with a romance cover, they kind of give you a dirty look because it has a stigma. So people would much rather hold an e-reader, and that's what made e-readers suddenly become a center of the publishing world and then spread from romance to everything else. It has a specific use that takes off, and then that enables it to disseminate and be used in all sorts of ways. And we see that with information technologies and other technologies over and over.
This is a bit of a turn, but again, we're coming back to technology, and you're bringing us back into this very moment and the way we're in real time seeing how our own reading habits are changing, and how we look back on a period of maybe only 20 years ago and think, oh gosh, when I used to read paper novels. This got me thinking. I wanted to ask, what is kind of the state of the art in thinking about what makes people modern among historians? Because this is always a question, right? That what is early modernity? People ask me, I'm sure they ask you, what constitutes modernity? What makes people modern? And does technology have to do with this? If it has anything to do with it at all. Something I noticed that both of us work on is we study people who in their own period were reading things from the past, right? Reading them, rereading them, circulating. I know in South Asia, one of the things that paper made possible was, this mass circulation of text, including very old ones, not just the ones that were being created then,
Yeah.
but also the classics. And like with one of the manuscripts I shared, people were reading things that had been written in the past, that had been written in classical languages, Sanskrit, Prakrit, Arabic, Persian, and they were writing in those languages, but also in the vernacular, and translating those ideas in more than one sense of the word translate, right?
Mhm.
And again, this had a lot to do with the possibilities of paper and big folios, where I loved your example where you've got the root text, you've got the
giant version and the tiny version. Yes.
exactly, yeah. So in South Asia, I mean, something I would argue is that part of what made people modern, if we can say, if we're going to use that word in early modernity, was them renegotiating their relationship with a past, and a past that was partly textual. And that was possible because they had just so many books and could actually exchange ideas across languages. And I wonder if there are analogs or divergences in the European example.
I mean, I would say there are absolutely parallels. One of the biggest defining moments at the Renaissance is when the Renaissance comes up with the idea of we're the Renaissance. We're going to slice history into 3 bits with ancient, middle, and us instead of into 2 bits, which is what Europe had done before. And they rethink the past. And how do we use the past? The past had all of these lost arts that maybe would be helpful in our present. Can we systematically go look at them? That there is a rethinking of how to use the past. Now, the Middle Ages had used the past all the time, right? And your education in the Middle Ages was Ovid and Virgil and Book 10 of Quintilian. It was ancient stuff, but there is a systematic, hey, let's use this ancient stuff in a new way, which happens in the Renaissance. And we're imitating it, we're commenting on it, we're reinterpreting it, we're disseminating it, we're letting more categories of people have access to it, so that it's not only the very narrow elites right at the royal court, it's anybody who's rich enough to go visit a banker's house. That banker will have some books and that person can look at them. There is a tiny sliver of a democratization of access to text, access to expression, access to learning, and also a democratization of interest in it. Because if a Renaissance scholar writes a big treatise in Latin, only a small fraction of his population is reading the treatise, but they all know he's a super celebrity. Everyone is talking about it. Even if they're not reading it, they're aware that it happened. It's a big deal, like when NASA announces they've landed on Mars, right? And it is an investment of the same scale. If a book costs as much as a house, then per GDP, a library costs as much as the moon landing. And when a city like Florence or Rome invests in a library, that is an investment on the scale of a moon landing. And so when someone says, we have a new translation of Plato, the civilization is excited by it on the level of the moon landing. And really does celebrate and identify and think, these ancient things, we're getting them back. So I would say one characteristic I definitely see is a lot of thinking about the past. What is it? How are we the same as it? How are we different from it? How do we use it? And then another is increase in different ways people are communicating. Humanity has lived in a constant, steady state of communications acceleration for all of modernity. And there is a big acceleration of how quickly can an idea move around that starts really in 1300, 1400 with more efficient production of manuscripts and more production of manuscripts, and keeps going, accelerating with Gutenberg. We're still in that, right? We're living in an information crisis where every time a new information technique arrives, Twitter exists and suddenly we have revolutions in the Middle East. But this has been the constant state for humanity for 500 years. We live in an ongoing information revolution. And every time there's an information revolution, then that affects society. It empowers new categories of people. It empowers government in different ways from the ways the government was powerful before. Different people get a hold of it and use it to express things which might have been suppressed under the earlier information medium, because censorship methods always lag behind the new tech. And, we invent Facebook, and then it takes a while to be like, oh, we need to have moderation policies on Facebook. There's always we've invented radio. Oh, no, now people are saying bad words on radio. We need to censor radio. There's always a lag in the effective censorship of a new medium. And that has been a constant. And it's funny that people don't tend to think it would have been a constant between the printing press and the digital age. People think, there's printing press and then nothing happens until digital age. But no, they're making new kinds of books. They're spreading books in new ways. They're developing methods for disseminating books. And I'll give one micro example, and then I would love you to respond with your end. In 1498 in Florence, there's a radical firebrand preacher, Savonarola, so charismatic he becomes effectively head of state for 4 years. He's the church is corrupt, we need reform. He really sounds like Luther when you read him. And he prints his sermons as pamphlets, and they circulate within Italy over the course of the 4 years he's in power, and then he gets crushed and executed and burned at the stake. In 1517, right, so we're talking 20 years later, only 20 years later, when Luther releases the 95 Theses, it's in print in London 17 days after he makes it available in Wittenberg. No technology has changed. It's the same printing press, but the network for disseminating material has changed. New communities of news runners exist, and being a news runner is now a job in a way it wasn't 20 years ago. The network is there. And in the same way that technically ebooks existed the first time anyone ever typed a book on a computer, but ebooks didn't exist until there were e-readers to make there be a distribution mechanism. There were micro revolutions in all of these different media over centuries, which meant a constant state of, we can use books in this new way. Now we can use books in this other new way, that kept slamming people. And that's one of the characteristics of the modern world, is that how information works and moves is always changing. And as a consequence, changing which voices are powerful and the ways in which government is and isn't powerful.
It's such a good point. I mean, two major points. One, you bring up that we assume that that technology-driven acceleration in communication and change started recently. No, as you said, that's at least half a millennium old. Again, South Asia is another example of that. The folks at the Mughal court knew exactly what was going on in Florence at the time, and they knew what was going on in kind of the Latin cosmopolis because they had Jesuits at the Mughal court. There were Jesuits in the Portuguese-held ports of Goa and along the along Malabar, and it's partly through spoken communications, but a lot of it is through exactly these types of written communication channels that you're mentioning. And it is not, and I think you make a very good point, we should not overestimate the forms of control that, say, what would we think of as a state or kind of political actors have over that, because so much of the way vernacular texts in particular work, or let's say vernacularized religion spread in South Asia, like Europe, is through merchants moving around. There are people who are traders and moving around all the time. They take their books with them and they take their ideas with them. I'll cut myself off there because I know we want to invite Anne back, I think, Dean Robertson,
Yes,
back to join us and to give other folks a chance to ask questions as well.
Well, this has been simply just a fantastic, thought-provoking conversation, and I'm sure we could continue. I would love to just continue to hear the two of you, but I think it's time to take some questions from the audience. We already have some, I'm delighted to say, and I just want to reiterate that please type your questions into the Q&A. We'll get to as many as we can in the next few minutes. So let me start with this one. Did the kind of alphabetic script used in Indian languages make printing with movable type more difficult than the alphabet used in Europe? Guess that's for Tyler.
It's a great question. And I'd love to direct I'd love to direct the person who asked it to the work of Ulrika Stark. Ulrika Stark, who also teaches, she's at the University of Chicago. She's a colleague of mine in my department, and has written about the ways that lithography took off in South Asia in a way that movable type didn't, precisely because of issues of script. There are, at the time that printing started in South Asia, and again, printing took a couple of hundred years to really gain traction. But there were some scripts at that time. There were, dozens of scripts being used. There are not only dozens of languages in South Asia, but even for a single language, like the language I work on, Hindi, there were 4 or 5 different common scripts that it was written in. Now, some of those scripts, let's take Hindi again as an example, some of those scripts are derived from the Arabic script, right? And so they are written right to left, and the letters have to be connected, and it's a very cursive script. And for something like that, movable type was very difficult. It took many decades to figure out how to do that efficiently, and so it did not take off fast. Also, this is interesting, when movable type was introduced for the Arabic script and languages written in that script in South Asia, people didn't like reading it. They found it quite strange, in particular because South Asia uses the Nastaliq script, where it actually kind of moves down diagonally as people write it. On the other hand, the Nagri script, and a couple of the examples I shared today were in the Nagri script, that the letters go left to right. You have consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, and it was relatively easy to create movable type for that. So again, this had consequences that people could not have predicted. For example, because it was technologically easier to print in that Devanagari, the Nagri script, which was the vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel. That script was able to gain a lot of traction at some point, and that began to play into the language politics that took over much of North India in the early 20th century. I'll just stop there, but I'll say that, yes, this question of just, syllabary scripts versus what we call abjad scripts, like the Arabic and Persian, made a tremendous difference in which technologies were adopted.
And it's useful to remember, too, just very briefly, that Europe has printing for about 60 years before it has movable type printing. That it, too, begins with the you carve a whole page as one woodblock. And it was doing that. It just wasn't doing that as widespreadly because it's much more expensive. So you only use it for things you really need lots of, specifically grammar books, pornography, sermon books, playing cards. That's about it. The really important things: pornography, sermon books, and playing cards.
In that order, I wonder. All right, that's great. And another one, I think this one will be mostly for Ada, but I just have to say that the questioner starts off by saying, "I love this conversation," and I agree. To clarify, are you saying that the increased use of paper and the democratization of books in Europe actually led to the printing press and not the other way around, as one might think?
Exactly. So in around 1380, a movement centered on Petrarch, the famous Italian poet, rethought and articulated a new project for how to use books. And their idea was Europe is dying. Europe is having an apocalypse. Europe has just had the Black Death. Everything is terrible. And they were right. The life expectancy had dropped from the high medieval average of 32 to the Renaissance average of 18. 18 average life expectancy is pretty rough. So they're in a very bad way. And they propose, let's reconstruct the library that raised the ancients. Let's reconstruct the library that raised Caesar. and that raised Cicero. And if we do that, we can raise our sons to be as successful as Caesar and Cicero, and then they will save us from doom. This is the plan. And this catches traction so that in the time between 1390 and 1450, that 60-year period, people start assembling substantial libraries, and multiple libraries of over 1,000 manuscripts are assembled within that window, some by states, some by individuals, some by kings, one by Cosimo de' Medici, who want to invest in this new kind of education for their princes and their sons to be able to become better leaders and be successful the way Caesar and Cicero did. That makes the demand for books skyrocket and the demand for manuscripts skyrocket. And Gutenberg is responding to an increased in demand. He responds to it way more than the market can handle. And Gutenberg goes bankrupt because if you're in a town where 5 people need copies of Cicero and you've printed 300 copies of Cicero and you sell 5 copies of Cicero, congratulations, Mr. Gutenberg, you have 295 unsold copies of Cicero and the bank wants its money back. They have to develop distribution mechanisms, and the first 2 generations of printers in Europe actually go bankrupt because they can't sell enough. But there was already a spike in demand, and he is meeting that need.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's really amazing. Well, now here's one for both of you, more of a technical question. Can you talk about the writing implements used as surfaces differed?
Writing implements. Should I go first, Ada?
Yeah, please.
Sure.
Yeah. So palm leaf is interesting because palm leaf actually most of the time gets carved. A stylus is more like a knife in which you carve the letters, and then a dry ash substance is rubbed into the palm leaf so that you can see the carved letters in there. There are also cases in which ash, what's called mussy or lamp black, collyrium, is used and is produced as ink. It's mixed with oil, and that produces an ink that can be used on palm leaf manuscripts. Incidentally, it's that same type of ink that's used on paper. However, paper is also absorbs paints differently, and so when paper gets introduced into the subcontinent and begins being used for illustrated manuscripts, the Jain and Hindu artists there had to adapt some of their techniques and some of their paint making practices, because it's the artists themselves who are making the paints from minerals. They have to adapt those for this new medium. Birch bark ink. Incidentally, I didn't mention this earlier, but cloth. Cloth ink doesn't work well on cloth, and there are a lot of cloth scrolls, cotton cloth scrolls from the early modern period. These tended to be painted, and you actually get scrolls which are meters and meters long, and they're painted from top to bottom. That's what I.
Yeah, I mean the big difference in a lot of ways when you're using a pigment to make a mark is how runny versus how gloppy and sticky is this. And when you're writing with a quill, you want something that's really runny so that it'll run off the quill. And that works very well on paper and on papyrus and on parchment. And it requires an ink whose solvent is alcohol, which is going to dry and dissolve very quickly, or whose solvent is otherwise, not water soluble, but an oil or something that dries fast but is really runny. When what you're trying to do is paint an image, you want something that's thicker, that's more like the texture you associate with paint, so that it's easier to have very fine control, and you're using a brush for that, and it doesn't absorb into the surface the way the really runny pen ink does. So an illuminated manuscript is using an ink whose pigments are dissolved in egg yolk, for example, instead of in alcohol. One of the big things Gutenberg has to do is make an ink that's opposite, because for printing, what you need is the gloppiest, stickiest possible ink so that it doesn't run down into the gaps between the letters. so that it stays up on the surface of the letters, and those are inky and the in-between stays white. So you need it to be the opposite from pen ink, the stickiest possible ink. And European printing press ink, the pigment is the same lamp black, it's ash. But you take a pot of oil and you set it on fire and you put it out and you set it on fire and you put it out and you set it on fire and you put it out and you set it on fire and you put it out. And every time you do that, it burns a little bit and it gets blacker and thicker and stickier and blacker and thicker and stickier. And then you put onions in it and you set it on fire a bunch. Then you take the onions out and eat them. And not only can you eat the onions, but also they prevent it from exploding, because sometimes this explodes. There are scorch marks on the front of a library I used to work with because of an experiment in confirming that they do explode. That was not a good thing to do in front of a library, but nonetheless it happens. So a lot of transformation in, what is it? Printing press ink is more different from handwriting ink than most handwriting inks are from each other, is a good way to put it, at least within the European sphere.
Wow. So fascinating. Well, here's another one. As part of or along with the impact of written texts, could you say a bit more, maybe we'll have both of you address this, about how significant ideas flowed back and forth among regions? We've heard a bit about this, but the second part we haven't said much about, and how this flow has resulted with credit for thoughts or practices being inappropriately attributed, or should we say misattributed, to one group or another. Was there a lot of confusion in these earliest printed texts, written texts?
That is an interesting question. I mean, I think part of it has to do.
Do authors even sign them? In South Asia, for example.
Right. It has to do not just with technology, but really with language. I mean, South Asia was, always the multilingual place. It's a big place. There are lots of languages. In the ancient and medieval periods, it's really Sanskrit and Prakrit, which are the link languages across that vast expanse. What happens in the early modern period, really in the second millennium, at the beginning of the second millennium, is people begin using regional languages more. And what this means is not so much a fracturing of ideas. It doesn't set up walls. In fact, what it means is a multiplication of translation activities across the subcontinent. And so you have a text like a famous text like the Mahabharata. There are hundreds of versions of the Mahabharata in so many languages. And those versions are not all derived from the Sanskrit epic. They're actually derived both from the Sanskrit epic and from each other. I've written in a book called Text and Tradition in Early Modern India that the early modern period in South Asia is really characterized not just by multilingualism, but in this constant exchange back and forth between different regions. They're exchanging ideas, they're exchanging literary practices. And this is also happening, let's say, between Islamicate or Muslim intellectuals in South Asia, Hindu intellectuals, Jain intellectuals. It's happening both across languages and across philosophical and scientific traditions. And so, to answer that question succinctly, I'd say, yes, it takes a lot of work to actually, pull apart these different threads to find out where did ideas start and where did they eventually move to, because a lot of things we associate now with, say, yoga, or things that we associate with Hinduism, or even things that we might associate with Islam in South Asia, are the product not of a single origin, the traditions themselves, but are the product of this very intense and rich exchange that happened in the late medieval and the early modern period.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, jumping very briefly to Europe, the ideas circulate between wealthy capitals. People are moving from court to court and powerful place to powerful place. And library building rapidly becomes a way to compete with your political neighbor that's an alternative to war, right? If you have the bigger, showier library, that's a way of showing you have the bigger, showier industry that's capable of also mustering a bigger, showier army. Maybe they don't want to fight you. And so libraries become a way that a state projects its power, much as today powerful superpowers project their power by winning a lot at the Olympics, right? Showing how much you can pour money into your athletic program is parallel. So we have the texts circulating to their capitals and then disseminating from the capitals outward. And the library you find in the capital of Hungary may be more similar to what you would find in Florence than what you would find in a town an hour's drive from Florence is, because it's wealth that enables the construction of these things. As for figuring out who wrote what, Europe has a fascinating obsession with an inferiority complex toward Greco-Roman antiquity. And so especially in the Renaissance period and everything up before 1600, when this changes a bit, anything said by an ancient person is better than anything a new person could say. And if you have something really original to say, you want to do it in a commentary on Aristotle or a commentary on Plato, because that's much more important than your original idea. So people weirdly bend over backwards to hide the fact that their innovative ideas are innovative ideas, and will claim, oh, I'm just translating Aristotle, I'm just translating Plato. This is, just a commentary on Livy, says Machiavelli in his discourses on Livy. That in a weird way, you try to deny having written something. And if I could briefly have the slide nicknamed porn in my slide index, this is a book that you'll see in a second, which is a fake volume of Aristotle. A work that wasn't Aristotle, that was attributed to Aristotle, exists only in English. It was written in English. It's referred to as Aristotle's complete masterpiece, displaying the secrets of nature in the generation of man. It is in fact porn. It claims to be Aristotle's book about midwifery. And the treatment of health and the family physician. You see there the illustration of a person who's been born covered with fur because their parents were thinking the wrong things while having sex and conceived while thinking the wrong stuff, and that's made the baby be covered with fur. But it is in fact pornography attributed to Aristotle. And lots of people attribute things of all sorts to ancient thinkers because your ideas are going to get more traction if they're believed to be Pliny than they are if they're believed to be like your new thing. That changes mostly around 1600, but is a neat little detail. Done with the slide.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Ada. This is going to have to be our last question. I'm so sorry. I know we'll ask Anastasia to preserve the questions so that our speakers can see them because they've been so fascinating. An example was given of ideas, this was Ada, I think, ideas and pamphlets reaching England from, I think it was Germany in 17 days. What kinds of information ended up moving more effectively, apart from romance novels in the present time, moving more effectively as written communication and documentation replaced oral transmission?
Tyler, do you want to go first?
Oh, okay. I'll keep mine short, and I'll join it to another question that came up, which was, what can we learn from this period that might inform the way we think about electronic media in our own period. The thing I would say that we always keep in mind when we study South Asia is never forget about the human element. Like for instance, written textuality never displaces orality. In fact, every book, I would argue, from South Asia, from the pre-colonial period, has an oral life, right? And even though people in the early modern period were using books all the time, orality and the face-to-face exchanges were still valorized as the best form, the most authentic and most, and this is important, the highest level of fidelity in transmission of knowledge. And so the famous poet Kabir, he was a poet Saint Kabir, said, "Poti pad pad jag mua, Pandit Bayana Koi, Ek Akar Prem Ka, Padiso Pandit Hoy, which says, the world was just reading and reading books, and the world read books until it up and died, and no one ever became wise. If someone would just read one letter of love, they would become wise, which is actually, a telegraphic appeal to actually loving the Guru, right? Loving God and loving the Guru. And if you actually sit at the Guru's feet and actually give them your attention and listen, you'll learn more than an entire library of books could ever tell you. And whether it's, early modern India, or whether it's the present moment, it's always the human element, which is unpredictable and creates technological change to spin out in all these directions.
Yeah, similarly to that, Shakespeare lived in a moment that the printing press was exploding in frequency, and he lived during a scary information revolution just like we do. And there's a passage in The Winter's Tale in which a bunch of illiterate farmers have been visited by a ballad monger who's selling news sheets. And they're crowding around saying, oh, what does this one say? What does this one say? What does that one say? Because they're actually illiterate, but they want to buy his news sheets because they can take them to the local priest who is literate, and he'll read them out to them. And the news sheets that are being sold are full of lies about flying mermaids and ridiculous things. And they all say, oh, and we know it's true because it's in print. So even during these print revolutions, there is a lot of awareness of anxiety about fake news. And you'll notice that all the way through Shakespeare's Henry IV and Henry V, one of the things that makes Henry V a good king is that he never believes rumors. He only believes when the official messenger has come to him and given him the official news. So there is this valorization of a person who was there and saw it will be more reliable. What circulates most in rapid fire pamphlets is going to be war news, celebrity gossip, royal weddings, and scandal rags. There's one of my favorite scandal rags, which is at the Newbury downtown, is the scandalous tale of a doctor in Padua and how he seduced his maid, murdered his wife, hanged the maid, cut out her heart and eaten it, and how he was justly punished by God. That's the title. And it gives you a sense of, as soon as people can, make cheap, fast news, it's the same cheap, fast news that we get. They want to know about war, they want to know about sieges, and they want to know about crises, and they want to know about prophetic visions, and the words of new, important, and charismatic religious leaders, especially heterodox ones that are outside the mainstream and can circulate via secondary channels, but they're very anxious about this. And there's always this, but it might just be a rumor. People shouldn't believe it just because it's in print. You also want to be there in person or talk to the person who's been there in person. And so being a news correspondent was a profession all the way through this period. People who go to court, see what really happened, and then ride to the next city to say. So print and manuscript and oral all being necessary to be present and compared to each other to get at the truth.
This is wonderful. This has just been a marvelous discussion. I can't thank you enough, Tyler and Ada, for your insightful responses to the audience questions, as well as your earlier discussions, which really, I think, have made us see things in a somewhat different light in several areas. So let me thank you all for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and we'll look forward to further opportunities to connect. I certainly look forward to seeing you all again on April 18th for our Spring Dean's Salon, which you'll hear more about soon. And please let me just wish you a very pleasant evening now. Thanks so much.